Well, please take your Bibles again and turn with me to Psalm 132. Psalm 132. As you are aware, over the past several weeks, I have been exploring a number of the Pilgrim songs that are found from Psalm 120 to Psalm 134. I wasn't sure how far I wanted to go into that exploration, but we are going to continue on this morning to Psalm 132. And the reason why is because there is a lot of Old Testament history alluded to throughout this psalm. You may have picked up on that as we read through it a moment ago. And on top of that, it gives us a message that is also very important as we gather week after week, taking our pilgrims to worship the Lord. And I want us to kind of meditate upon that this morning as well. In fact, I pointed out on several occasions that over the past few weeks in these 15 pilgrim songs, there are themes that really get to the heart of who we are as people of God that we often are almost unavoidable to think about. We've talked about trouble, we've talked about confusion in life, we've talked about family life in some of these. Of course, the place of worship is mentioned many times throughout these psalms as well. And this morning we're going to talk about another one that I think should be at the forefront of our hearts often when we come and gather to worship the Lord. And that theme we'll uncover should really resonate in our hearts as we make a journey to worship the Lord week by week. Now, if you look down at Psalm 132, you'll probably notice, as I mentioned, it is one of the longest pilgrim songs. In our text, there are 18 verses in this song. That is twice as long as the second longest of the pilgrim songs. The second longest is Psalm 122. Most of these songs average about 6 verses apiece. A lot of them, especially 3 out of the last 4 of them, average about 3 verses. That's all that's there. And last week you noticed, the last 2 weeks, we looked at some really short songs. But this one is 18 verses. That's communicating a truth that should, again, resonate in our hearts. We need to remember this. In addition to that, you may have picked up on this as well as we read through it. This may be the most confusing of the Pilgrim songs. There's a couple that could probably qualify for that. But this one is a little bit uncertain about what you do with some of the details of this song. And so it can be a little challenging to get our handle on, but we're going to give it a good try this morning. The first thing I want to do as we kind of start out is analyze it from a big position, if you will, from above the psalm, and try to figure out how is best to break down the message of what the psalmist is communicating to us. And I say that because if you study this in any depth, you'll discover there's a lot of different theories or a lot of different ways different expositors have kind of broken the passage apart. For instance, there are some who argue that there's just 2 main sections in this entire psalm. Their argument is the first section runs from verses 1 through 10, and it is a prayer. The last section runs from 11 through 18, and it is an answer to the prayer that was prayed. Now, it's interesting because the prayer, as you may have picked up on in verse 1, is about David. You can see that in verse 1 when the song opens with the words, "Lord, remember David and all his afflictions." And the answer in verse 11 comes when the psalmist writes, "The Lord has sworn in truth unto David. He will not turn from it." In other words, the Lord is going to remember David. However, there are others who seek to divide this psalm into 4 sections. They would argue that verse 1 is Israel's prayer for David. Verses 2 through 9 is David's vow to God. Verse 9 is Israel's second prayer for David. And then verses 11 through 18 is God's vow to David. And that division kind of works pretty well too, because what you have in the first half is David's desire to build a house for the Lord. And then what you have in the second half is God's desire to build a house for David. And if that language sounds familiar, it's because it's taken from the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7. But this morning, I'm not going to use either of those divisions. I'm going to chart my own course a little bit, but this is not unique to me as well. I'm going to divide the passage into 3 parts. And I think that when you clearly analyze the psalm, what you have here is really one major story being told in 3 different acts. In other words, the first subject being discussed in verses 1 through 5 has to do with David's desire to find a permanent dwelling place for God. The second subject being discussed in verses 6 through 10 has to do with the Ark of the Covenant being restored and finding a resting place in the temple. And then the third story, if you will, subject being discussed, is verses 11 through 18, concerns God's faithfulness, and that's going to be our major theme this morning, God's faithfulness to keep his covenant with David. Obviously, all 3 of those themes are closely interrelated. They're very much meshed together, which is why I think this song is one big story being sung about in 3 different acts or movements, if you will. What you have here is a story about David's desire to build a temple. in which the house of God's covenant would be housed, and God in turn honors David with a promise of a Davidic dynasty. So you got one big story into 3 acts, and we're going to look at Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 this morning, as God is faithfully fulfilling His word to the house of David. Now the question's been asked, well, when was this song written? And I kind of pointed out in our reading this morning that we're not even sure who wrote the song. But I would like to suggest a possibility of when this song was written. And I believe personally that this was a song that may have been written on the occasion when Solomon was dedicating the temple that had been built for God's glory. In fact, in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, you can read the prayer that Solomon prays when he's dedicating the temple for the worship of God. And as you read through, it's a very long chapter, but what you will discover is that it appears Solomon picks up, I think it's verses 8 through 11 of this psalm, and quotes it in his prayer in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, which is intriguing to me because the way I play that out in my mind, and I may be mistaken about this, is I would guess perhaps this is a psalm that was written for that occasion. Perhaps it had been sung by a Levitical choir for that occasion, and as Solomon is closing the dedication of the temple, perhaps he heard those words. Maybe Solomon even wrote these words. We don't know, but he incorporates the message of the song into his prayer to God. And so my feeling about this is that this was a song that was written for the occasion of dedicating the temple. Although, I will admit, I can't be dogmatic about that. But it fits really well there. Now, how then, or what are we to do with this song? Well, if you were forced to nail down the main theme, I think that kind of weaves its way through the entirety of the song, I would argue again that the theme seems to be God's faithfulness and God's presence with His people. Many of you are aware, of course, that the temple and the Ark of the Covenant do represent the presence of God. We're symbols of God's presence. We're symbols of God's faithfulness. The Ark of the Covenant, of course, containing the law of God. And, of course, the mercy seat above the Ark of the Covenant that also speaks of God's presence and God's work within the nation of Israel as well. And then again, the Davidic covenant that God will kind of close this song out with speaks of God's faithfulness to the house of David and to His work and His plan even throughout the entire world. And so what we have here, I'm going to argue, is a pilgrim singing about God's faithfulness. You could add God's presence into that as well with His people, but God's faithfulness, and men and women, that's a theme that we should carry with us. I've incorporated that in our prayers this morning and our songs this morning. As we gather to worship the Lord, one of the joys it is to focus on the faithfulness that God has demonstrated to us. Not just through the entirety of our life, but even the past 7 days since the last time we met together. How has God shown His faithfulness to you? Ronnie Hill this morning mentioned just the rain outside and the fact that God gives us what we need in His timing and in His ways. That's part of God's faithfulness to us. Maybe there was other ways that God demonstrated just strength for you in the midst of a difficult time or a couple of hours of worry or anxiety where God just ministered and was faithful to you in some ways this past week. There's so many ways that God is faithful to us, and this song is seeking to capture one aspect of God's faithfulness as we journey to worship the Lord. So what we're going to do is start with Act 1. This act has its focus as the building of the temple. What brought the building of the temple in Jerusalem from being a desire in David's heart to becoming a reality? Well, notice how the song begins. Again, verse 1. Lord, remember David and all his afflictions. I find that an interesting beginning, because what that song tells me is that it pulls our mind back into a time when all the troubles of David and that he faced in life. And men and women, in order to understand the troubles or the afflictions that David faced, we need to go on a little bit of a whirlwind tour this morning throughout the history of Israel. In other words, the troubles of David are not confined just to his life. There was a whole stream of history that intersected David's life at his birth that informs us of his afflictions and troubles. So I'm going to take some time this morning. I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story of Israel's history. We're going to recount some things because this is part of what God's people do. Going back and recounting, thinking back through how God has worked in the past, not just in nations like Israel, but even in our own personal lives as well, and remembering these things, that's part of glorifying God's faithfulness. So, what are some things that brought David to the point of his afflictions? Well, you remember all the way back in Genesis that God promised Abraham that He would make of him a great nation. You begin seeing that work being worked out in Abraham's life when his son Isaac is born, and of course Jacob is born, and then Jacob has all this pastoral sons that was born to him as well. And you recall that they go down to Egypt, and they are going to be down there for at least 400 years, and all the troubles and struggles that they have down there. By the time you meet them in Exodus and they are in Egypt, they have formed up an ethnically singular people who were covenanted together when they leave Egypt at Sinai to be God's people. Of course, God intended to give them a promised land, the land of Canaan. After spending some 40 years wandering around in a wilderness, God begins fulfilling some of those promises to them. But do you remember what happened when they initially settled back into the land of Canaan? What did they fail to do? Okay, they failed to drive out the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. It was going to be a major stumbling block for them throughout the majority of their history. But folks, do you also remember that that nation was mostly unified throughout the wilderness wanderings and the conquest of the land of Canaan? They were together. They were on one page. They were fighting a common enemy. They were facing a common situation. And that's so much the case throughout the roughly 300-year period of time. What you discover is a jarring disconnect than what you had been reading in the book of Exodus. In fact, what you discover is that during the 300 period of time in the book of Judges, that they had been fractured and they had been splintered into their respective tribes. There is some debate of how long the time period of the Judges lasted, but what there is no debate is this. There was no central government during the time of the Judges. All you have in the book of Judges are the tribes sinning against God. You remember this pattern. There was this oppression that would come, and then God would raise up a deliverer, a judge, to deliver them from the oppression. But I want to just point out that if you read the book of Judges carefully, you will notice that the judges are primarily local judges. I don't know if you've ever thought about this or not. They don't tend to influence the entire nation. They are raised up to rescue certain tribes from isolated oppression. You have some judges that will focus on a tribe in the south. Some judges focus on a tribe in the north. And when there were occasions that some tribes gathered together to fight a common enemy, you find that it's only 2 or 3 tribes that seem to gather together. It's not the entire nation. You rarely see the nation galvanized together as a collection of tribes to fight a common enemy during the period of the Judges. But in addition to that, out of the 15 or so judges that rise up during this 300 or so year period of time, what you discover is they all have major character flaws. And the whole society of Israel just kind of lurches from one crisis to another crisis, and there's no permanent structures of government, and there's this downward spiral into depravity that threatens to undo the nation. That's why you have those last 2 accounts at the end of Judges. I don't know the last time you read Judges, but let me remind you of the last 2 accounts. They're messed up. Let me say it this way. They're messed up accounts of people's lives during the period of the Judges. The first of those is about a priest named Micah. It's the story about how the tribe of Dan persuaded Micah away from his clan to be their priest. How a battle ensued over the false gods and idols. Chapter 18 opens with a refrain, "There was no king in Israel," and it closes, can you imagine this, with one of the descendants of Moses serving as a priest for the tribe of Dan while using the idol Micah had made while in the house of God at Shiloh. It's just convoluted. The whole thing is messed up. And then the other story is in chapter 19 and following. The chapter opens with these words, "In those days there was no king in Israel," as if this is kind of a major theme. There are no kings, no central government. And what happens in this account is that a Levite and his concubine take center stage. It's about how the tribe of Benjamin abused the concubine of the Levite, how they killed her, how the rest of the tribes did galvanize together. One of the few times in the book of Judges, they all gathered together and they attacked the tribe of Benjamin out of revenge. So much so and so severe that Benjamin was threatened into oblivion because there were so few of the men left. And here is how they addressed it. The rest of the tribes, they developed a twisted plot to steal other women from other villages and to give them to Benjamin. And the whole thing is sordid. The whole thing is just messed up. Which is why the book of Judges closes with a refrain, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes." In other words, there was a kind of anarchy that was experienced in the land of Israel. And folks, as bad as Israeli society had become during the time of the Judges, do you know that they're going to take another step down when you open into 1 Samuel? It actually gets worse than this. Because as you transition away from the period of the Judges, 1 Samuel opens up about how bad things were at the place of worship, the tabernacle in Shiloh. You remember what was going on in Shiloh at the tabernacle? Who was the main character there, the main high priest in Shiloh during this period of time? What's that? His name was Eli. He was the priest. Remember Eli? He had 2 sons. What do you know about those 2 sons? They were doing 2 absolutely horrible things. Number 1, they were using the worship of God to line their pockets. They were profiting off their position as priest within the tabernacle. And then number 2, unbelievably, they were using the tabernacle as a place to abuse the women who would come worship the Lord. Absolutely heinous, horrible sin was taking place. So much so that God comes through the mouthpiece of Samuel, who actually works kind of like a judge, the last judge to come along, to tell Eli that God was going to judge his house. God was going to deal with how horrible this is. Just like in the time of the Judges. Essentially, it's still the time of the Judges in the first part of Samuel. The last judge that will be raised up is Samuel. And you'll recall in chapter 4 of 1 Samuel, the Philistines invade Israel. The people had the idea, amazingly, shockingly, they had the idea, let's go to Shiloh, to the tabernacle. We'll take the Ark of the Covenant, and we are going to carry the Ark into battle. You say, why did they do that? Because they had this really crazy idea. It was a superstitious idea. It was a blasphemous idea that we could use the Ark of the Covenant like a lucky rabbit's foot. Some kind of magical talisman that nobody can defeat us if we're carrying this ark in front of us. And the Philistines, there's no way they can stand before that. But do you remember what happened? What happened is Israel was defeated. What happened is the ark was taken by the Philistines. What happened was Eli's 2 sinful sons were killed. And when Eli hears the news, remember he falls off backwards from his seat. He breaks his neck and he dies. What happens is it triggers that his daughter-in-law will go into labor. She names her son Ichabod, which means the glory of Israel has departed. She ends up dying as well. So the ark is gone, the high priest is gone, the high priest family is gone, her husband's gone, and she dies as well. At that point, Israel reached what may be the lowest point in their history. For the next 3 chapters in 1 Samuel, they're all about the ark. How the Philistines try to set up, imagine this, they try to set up the ark of the living God in the temple of their pagan gods, the primary one being Dagon. How the Lord made the Philistines sick with tumors. The Philistines plot to get the ark of Israel back into the land of Israel. How they put it on a cart and some cows kind of pulled it into Israel, where it ended up in a village by the name of Beth-Shemesh, where 70 men died because they dared look into the ark. At that point, the ark was moved to a village called Kiriath Jearim. I want you to remember that village name. That's actually going to be very important. Kiriath Jearim, or Jearim. That village was near the borders of the tribe of Benjamin and Dan in the southern region of Israel. The ark would remain in that village for 20 years until Israel began getting right with God. But even after they began getting right with God, that ark would continue for probably another 80 years at Kiriath Jearim. During this time, the people of Israel were getting tired of their tribal status, all the infighting, the lack of government power, and the wickedness of society. It's going to lead them to go to Samuel the prophet, the last judge, and request a king. At this point, God had ostensibly been the king over Israel, but of course nobody was paying attention to him. So they decided they wanted a king that would make them like all the other nations. A king that they thought would consolidate power, organize a government, provide protection from other nations like the Philistines, and frankly, protection from one another, because look at how they've been living one to another. And basically, instead of trusting and relying on the Lord, they decided to trust and rely on a king. So what did they do? Well, the text of Scripture tells us. They pick a man after their own heart. They pick Saul. He was the handsomest, the tallest that they could find. In other words, the qualifications for a king were completely external. In the end, it would be disastrous. They didn't care about character of the man. They didn't care whether the man loved God or not. They didn't care whether he wanted to do right or not. They wanted somebody who could win a popularity contest or a beauty pageant. But God had other plans. He knew there was a young man, a man by David, who loved God with all his heart. The kind of man that God wanted to be the king. In fact, that's why Scripture says that David was a man after God's own heart. That phrase does not primarily mean that David had a heart for God, although that clearly was the case. But God had a heart for a man like David, who would love him and who would seek to serve him and who would seek to do what was right in the land of Israel. And folks, the people had a heart for Saul. God had a heart for David. Why? Because David loved God, and he wanted to pursue the things of God. And so God, you recall the story, has David anointed by Samuel to be the next king. And yet, what is the life of David like for all those years he served Saul? Well, that leads us right back into verse 1 again this morning. That leads us right back into the psalm where David spent a life of afflictions. Do you know that word affliction pretty much summarizes almost the entirety of David's life? From little boy all the way up to aged king. That is David's life right there. He would spend the first years of his life, of course, facing a family that did not understand him. We talked about that with a David and Goliath episode a few weeks ago. He would move on to be able to serve Saul as his king, and he served loyalty, but for his trouble, what did he get? He got afflictions when Saul jealously moved to murder David. Here is David flying for his life. He gathers around him basically the riffraff of Israeli society. He's out there in the wilderness. It's a miserable existence, being chased by Saul's army, never knowing when he was going to slip up and be imprisoned, perhaps even be killed. Then after David becomes king, what does his life look like? Well, it wasn't a bed of roses. He would fight battle after battle after battle as he faced the enemies of Israel. And men and women, he was constantly fighting these enemies. He was constantly on the alert for trouble. He had no rest during his reign. Even near the end of his life, there were threats against his kingdom as well. It was one life of constant trouble and afflictions. And yet this psalm explains what is the foremost thought of David's heart really all throughout his entire life. Because verse 2, it says, David is going to make an oath unto the Lord and make a vow unto the mighty God of Jacob. And here's the vow, verse 3. Surely I will not come into the tabernacle of my house, nor go up into my bed. I will not give sleep to mine eyes or slumber to mine eyelids, until I find out a place for the Lord and a habitation for the mighty God of Jacob. Say, what's all that about? Folks, it's about David's desire to build a permanent dwelling place for God. See, David thought something was missing in Israel. Yeah, he had become king. In fact, he had united the nations in many respects. But let me tell you something. God's ark and his presence, if I can use that phrase, was still isolated in a rundown-looking tent that David probably felt ashamed about. Here he is dwelling in his own house that he has built. He has, in that respect, a comfortable existence. But the ark of God was still dwelling in a tent. And so his desire was to build a permanent structure, a temple, for the ark of God to house in. And the fact you can read about this in 2 Samuel 7. I'm not going to have you turn there, but you remember the account. And I love the account because there's a neat interplay between David and the prophet Nathan. David says to Nathan one day, you know, my desire, my heart, is to build the structure for God, for his presence, for his glory. This is what I want to do. And Nathan turns to David, and I imagine they were really pretty good friends. And Nathan turns to David and says, you know what, David? That's a good desire. Go do all that's in your heart. And Nathan's really speaking more as a friend than he is really as a prophet of God. And here's how we know that. Because the next day, or that night, God comes to Nathan and goes, listen, you need to go back to David, and you need to tell David it's not really going to be his place to build the temple. I don't have that for him. But here's what I want you to tell David. I want you to tell him that I am going to do something for you, David. I am going to build a house for you. And I love the interchange because it reminds us that when God's people who are consecrated to God desire to do something for God, and God has laid something on their heart to do it, one of the best things you can do is to encourage them to do that. That's what Nathan does to David. David has been consecrated to God. He's been serving God. He wants to love God. Not that he doesn't mess up from time to time. We know he does, sometimes royally, but he is seeking to honor God. And Nathan says, you know what? Go ahead and do what's in your heart. What a great piece of advice to tell somebody who loves the Lord and wants to serve him. You say, why is that? Because God has the power to change the direction of somebody's life if he doesn't want them to do that. And that's what happens with David. God changes the direction and says, David, the temple building will not be for you. And God sends Nathan back with that message. And yet the whole vow indicates that David is not at rest and peace. He has such a heart for the Lord and for His glory. He's saying, you know what? I could be at rest in my house. By this point in his life, he does have somewhat a measure of peace. His afflictions aren't as great as they had been for most of his life. And you could kind of understand where David would have said, I can just kind of coast the rest of the way. Now, of course, let me add that God doesn't need a house, does He? I just want to make sure we highlight this truth. God doesn't need a house. We are reminded of that both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. For instance, Isaiah 66 verse 1 says, the heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house that ye built unto me, and where is the place of my rest? And the point that God simply is making is, there's no mere temple that can hold me. You can't confine me to a house somewhere in some location. This is one of the points that Stephen makes in Acts chapter 7. He's preaching to the Sanhedrin. Those Jewish people thought they had God kind of boxed in right there in the temple, right there in Jerusalem. We got God confined right here for us. And Stephen quotes Isaiah 66 verse 1 and says, no, that's really bad theology. You can't confine God to a temple. You know, Paul makes the same argument with the Gentiles in Acts 17 on Mars Hill. He talks about the fact that God's the one who made everything there is, this whole creation. And he says, seeing the Lord in heaven and earth dwells not in temples made with hands. You see, God doesn't need a temple, but folks, God does not rebuke David for this desire. Here's the reason why. God had plans for the city of Jerusalem. God had plans for a temple to be in Jerusalem. In fact, I think God had plans of which David did not even really fully understand or comprehend. But David had a good desire that God wanted to use to further His plan and His purposes in the world during that day and even in the world to come. And men and women, what verses 1 through 5 illustrate is that our spirit should be like David's. A desire to be used of the Lord. A desire to be used to serve God. I mean, here's David. He could have focused on his comfort, on his ease of life. He had fought a lot of battles. He had won a lot of battles. He could enjoy maybe the twilight years of his life, but he doesn't do that. He stands as a testimony to all the children of Israel and really all God's people that God's interest and God's glory and God's fame should trump our desires. This is what David reveals to us in a psalm like this. No wonder he was a man after God's own heart. In the past several centuries of Israel's history, there had not been a man quite like David. There really hasn't been. A man that wanted God's fame and God's glory to be known. A man that wanted to unite the people of God in such a way that God receives all the glory for what He's doing within the nation of Israel. Now, he can't be at home and at rest and in his own bed when he knows that there's that burning desire on his heart. And yet far too often we're content with that. That drive that motivates David in this passage, how often is it missing in our own hearts and lives? Well, what better song to sing on the way to worship than a song like this? A song about David that set aside his comfort and his ease. A song about David that sets aside his whole house and his own privileges and his own opportunities to say, you know what, I want to focus on the Lord. I want to serve Him with joy and gladness. I want to keep pressing forward for the Lord. Men and women, that should speak volumes to us as God's people. We get often focused on our own things, that we forget that there is a God to worship, and there's a God to serve, and there's a God to glorify within the company of His people. And David's heart in this psalm is to set aside his ease and his comfort and even his older age to pursue the glory of God in a place of worship. That's how the first act closes. But let's move now to the second act. That's only part of the story. The second act is verses 6 through 10. You will notice that it's all about the Ark of the Covenant. That Ark is specifically mentioned in verse 8. But in verse 6, it's referred to with the pronoun it. Notice this. It says in verse 6, Lo, we heard of it at Ephratah. Now, I need to pause. Do you know where Ephratah is located? Some of you actually do. You don't realize it, though. We talk about Ephratah during one season of the year pretty frequently. In fact, I'll tell you where you'll most frequently encounter Ephratah. It's in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, and it's the Christmas season that we often quote this verse. Do you know where Ephratah is located once I give you those clues? Yeah, it's around Bethlehem. Here's the verse. He says in Micah 5:2, But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose going forth have been from of old, from everlasting. Clearly, Ephratah is the region around Bethlehem. But here's the problem in verse 6. Why does this song mention hearing of the ark in Ephratah? Who's in Ephratah? Who lived in Ephrata? Who grew up in Ephrata? David grew up in Ephrata. In other words, what David is saying is, I lived in Ephrata. I spent my whole childhood in Ephrata. That's my hometown. That's my region I grew up in. But we only heard about the ark in Ephrata. Implying unspoken, no one's really laid eyes on the ark. Yeah, we've heard about it down here in Bethlehem, but I don't know what it looks like. Never see it. It's like the ark has kind of completely driven itself away. It didn't do it itself, but they had driven the ark away from the consciousness of the nation of Israel. You say, well, why is that? Well, where was the ark at this time? Remember that village I told you to remember just a moment ago? Remember I said we're going to come back to that name? Okay, that's where the ark is when this account or this passage takes place. That ark was in that little village. Kiriath Jearim was the name of it. Now look at the end of verse 6. Here's what David says. It says, we found it in the fields of the wood. That's an interesting expression. We found the ark in the fields of the woods. Why is that? Because Kiriath Jearim was in a location between the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of Dan in a wooded area, kind of a foresty area. In fact, that expression in the Hebrew text, the field of the woods, is the Hebrew word for jar. You can kind of hear the connection. Kiriath Jearim, we found it in Jar, the fields of the woods is where they said it. In other words, what David is saying is, since I was a little boy, I heard about the Ark of the Covenant. But the nation really hasn't laid eyes on it. The reason why is because it was basically forgotten. All of a sudden we discovered it, and everybody was like, what's the Ark doing down here in the fields of the woods? It was at Kiriath Jearim. Now, do you remember what happened when they rediscovered the Ark in the fields of the woods? What did David do? Remember this story? What's that? He's going to move it. He's like, we got to get that thing out of here and let's go take it to the capital city, to Jerusalem. And so David goes down there full of excitement. And you remember what happens? He puts it up on this cart. He's carrying it back and it starts to rock and get unsteady. And a guy named Uzzah reaches out his hand to touch it. And God strikes him down dead. Party over, if I can use that expression. No more excitement. People are afraid of the Ark of the Covenant. So much so that the Ark of the Covenant ends up lodging at the house of a guy named Obed-Edom for 3 months. And God blessed that man. And so as David sees that God blessing that man, he says, you know what? I think God does want us to bring the ark. And they decide to do it the right way this time. They weren't supposed to carry it on a cart. So they go down to Obed-Edom's house. They bring the ark in, and this is the occasion where it says that David was jumping up and dancing before the Lord. He's like a little boy jumping up and down, coming into Israel, coming into Jerusalem, celebrating. And there were these sacrifices, and there was this music, and there were gifts that David gave out to all those who came for this occasion for the ark to be brought in. Now, the temple hasn't been built. They had to set up a tent for the ark to be housed in. But they're bringing the ark in, and David's excited. You say, why would David do all that? Why would he respond this way? Well, here's the psalm that explains it. This song says that from the time David was a young boy, the ark had captivated his heart. This had been his heartbeat since he was a little boy. He wanted desperately to bring the ark. Can you imagine David as a shepherd out in the sheep fields? And he's thinking about the ark of God and the past work of God in the nation and this great presence of God. And yet he says, this ark is somewhere and we're not even sure where it is. And my heart has always been to unite Israel and to really bring in God's presence among his people. And now David, have you ever had the opportunity to fulfill a lifelong dream from childhood? You say, yeah, I always wanted to be a baseball player growing up, and I never had that opportunity. But there's certain things in life that I wanted to do since I was a little boy or a little girl. And I got to be, when I was 45 years old or something like that, I was allowed to accomplish what I wanted to. And you were just so tickled about that. Yeah, it would be something special to you, and nobody else would even care about it. But for you, that was a neat thing. Think in those terms for David. Since I was a little boy, I've always wanted to see this happen. I wanted to know where the ark was, and I wanted to bring it in, and I wanted God's people to unite around God's fame and God's glory. And that's what's happening. No wonder he's dancing and jumping up and excited about what God's doing. He is fulfilling a lifelong dream of his to bring in the worship of God. And folks, in verse 7, he wanted to go into the tabernacles and worship before God. He wanted in verse 8 the ark to find rest with the people of God. He wanted in verse 9 for the priest to have this inward clothing of righteousness and for the saints of God's people to rejoice. This was a boyhood dream come to fruition. When most boys were thinking about games and hunting and building a business or starting a family or whatever, David was different. He had a heart for God. He wanted an ark that represented God to be settled in the midst of God's people. Before God had been pushed to the peripheral of the life of Israel. That was what all the history of Judges was all about. Just one convoluted mess after another, disunity, fighting one another, killing one another. God's glory wasn't seen. This is what David wanted. So in Act 1, he wanted a temple. In Act 2, he wanted the ark to be settled into that temple as in the midst of God's people. But notice, as Act 2 closes, there's another prayer here. It says, "For thy servant David's sake, turn not away the face of thine anointed." I want to pause right there. Do y'all know what the word anointed literally means? Define it a couple different ways. It literally is the word from where we get the word Messiah. And there's some expositors who would argue that what this verse is talking about is Jesus himself, the Messiah who would come. Others say, no, this is still about David. He was the anointed, literally anointed to be the ruler, the king of Israel during his day. That's true as well. Now, whether it's David or the Messiah, I don't think we can be as dogmatic about that. But the prayer is that for thy servant David's sake, turn not away thy face from thine anointed. Whether that's for David or the coming Messiah. But keep that thought because we're going to come back to it in a moment. This leads us then into Act 3. And this is the focus on the Davidic covenant. The prayer of verse 10 is, don't reject your anointed, whether that's Jesus or not, for David's sake. You say, how does that play out? Well, again, you remember the story. You remember how David, when he told Nathan, I want to build a house, Nathan came back and said, not for you, but here's what I'm going to do for you, David. I'm going to build a house for you. Do you remember what David did on that occasion? It's the 2 Samuel 7. What did David do when God said, I'm going to build a house for you, David? It's going to be a house in which you will have someone who's going to rule on your throne forever. Your family is a dynasty I will establish, and there will always be someone ruling on your throne from your family. What did David do on that occasion? The text says that he went to that tent in which the Ark of the Covenant was housed, and he sat before the Lord, and he just humbly praised and worshiped God. He couldn't believe that God would do something as stupendous as make promises to him and his family the way he did. That's what David would do. He was overwhelmed with these things. And folks, what you have then in verses 12 through 18 of this psalm is the detailing of all the different blessings that David and his family would have upon the children of Israel and really all of God's creation. For instance, you have things like this, verse 12. If thy children will keep my covenant and my testimony that I shall teach them, their children shall also sit upon thy throne forevermore. That's the Davidic covenant. And there's a lot we could say about that, but for sake of time, I'm not going to go into too many details. Except I do want to point out that you notice that verse begins with a conditional if. Do you see that there? That word if that's there is conditional. You go, wait a second, I thought the promise to David was unconditional. Well, yes, it was unconditional to David, but it was conditional to David's children. You say, well, how does that play out? Remember how that plays out? We've talked about this before. Who was the next son of David to sit on the throne? Okay, it was Solomon. Trick question here. Was Solomon the son through which the Messiah would come that would be the ultimate fulfillment of David's son that would sit on the throne? The answer actually is no to that. If you read the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1, it's the genealogy of Joseph, which did come through Solomon's line. But remember, Jesus was not born as a son of Joseph. Jesus was born, if you look at the genealogy from Luke chapter 3, through the son of David named Nathan. Jesus was a direct descendant of Nathan, and he was adopted into Solomon's line when Joseph adopted him as his firstborn son, so he has the right to rule. But Solomon, if you remember, forfeited the privilege of this blessing by sinning against the Lord. And yet God still fulfilled that covenant to David through his son Nathan in Luke chapter 3. And the Messiah was born as a son of David through the line of Nathan. You say, why the change? Because the Davidic covenant was conditional for David's son. Solomon forfeited the condition. He didn't keep the covenant and the testimonies as he was supposed to. Therefore, his family was not a direct forefather for Jesus the Messiah. It would be Nathan. However, because of the Davidic covenant, the Lord did choose, as we continue reading through verses 12 through 18, He chose Zion for His habitation. He will rest there and dwell there forever. He will abundantly bless Zion, her provisions, and satisfy her poor with bread. He will clothe her priests with salvation and her saints with the shouts of joy. The horn or throne of David shall bud. Then notice this, verse 17. I have ordained a lamp for mine anointed. There's that word again. I told you to remember it. I have ordained a lamp for my anointed. I would like to suggest this anointed definitely is talking about the Messiah. Say, why is that? Because all these promises can only be fulfilled through Jesus Christ. All that He has guaranteed Israel is going to come to pass in the millennial kingdom one day when the Lord sets up His throne, rules from the throne of David, and He rules over Israel and the entire world. In fact, He says, His enemies will I clothe with shame, but upon Himself shall His crown flourish. This is what David gets to enjoy and anticipate. And men and women, this is what we get to enjoy. You want to know why? Here's why. Because God will be faithful to His promises. That's what this whole psalm's about. It's why Solomon is quoting it in the dedication of the temple in 2 Chronicles chapter 6. God is going to be faithful to His promises, men and women. Even all this story that seems somewhat obscure to us and all the details of how it's worked out and how the ark got there and God's plan to put His name on the city of Jerusalem and on that temple and that location, and that will be true in the millennial kingdom as well. You see the seeds of this. And God says, you know what, David? I am going to fulfill my word that He gave to us all the way in Genesis chapter 3. Through your family, a Messiah will be born, an anointed one. All these promises will fall on Israel. I'm going to be faithful. Even if some of your descendants aren't, I'm going to be faithful to my word. And men and women, that should encourage us. If you choose to sing and focus as a pilgrim upon God, and remember His faithfulness to the land of Israel and to you as well, here's what you have the opportunity to do. You will have the opportunity, here's my application this morning, you will have the opportunity to have just as much influence in many respects as David had to his descendants. You know, David here so loved the Lord, so wanted to honor the Lord, that he did set aside his ease and his comfort to be used of God, and God says, you know what, I'm going to use you to influence others. And that's what this psalm is highlighting for us. As we gather to worship the Lord week by week, and we focus upon God's faithfulness to us, part of the faithfulness to us is when we serve God and we honor Him and we seek to live for His glory, He in turn uses that to influence others in our lives as well. And I'm telling you right now, sometimes you do not know how staggering that will be. I assure you, David did not understand all the implications of that. But men and women, so many times as we look into our future, we don't understand as well. You go, well, I got just a little bit of influence here. You know, I got my family here and I got a few coworkers here, and you don't know how your testimony of worshiping God, of glorifying Him, of living for His honor and glory, you have no idea how that's going to turn out. I do know this, God has made some promises to you in His faithfulness. I do know that God has chosen to honor His name through His people. And my encouragement to you is as you focus upon the faithfulness of God is to keep living for His glory. Keep pursuing the path He's given to you. And here's what I know God will do. One day you will stand in glory and you will be, I'm convinced, we will be amazed at how God used our testimonies. The things we never even saw in life. The implications that are so far-reaching that maybe 2 or 3, 4 generations down from us, people that don't even know our name, will be blessed because of a testimony we stood for the Lord and how that transpired throughout human history. That's what this psalm is reminding us of. And men and women, the Lord will do that for us. Pilgrims do things in life for the sake of God's glory. They stand back and they pray the same kind of prayer that's being prayed. We say things like this, Father, remember by your grace that I was faithful. You ever prayed that? That's not a bad prayer. Father, remembered by your grace I was faithful. Remember by your grace I fulfilled your word, just as David could pray, just as being prayed for David. Remember, I set aside my ease and my pleasures and my goals to be honoring to you. And Father, I am praying for your faithfulness. And God says, I will be faithful. I will fulfill. God will do that. In fact, the song ends with the words again, your enemies will I clothe in shame, but upon himself shall his crown flourish. There will be a crown. I know that's speaking to the Messiah. I'm convinced of that. But there will be rewards and there will be crowns. And Psalm 132 is a psalm in which we sing of the faithfulness of God that motivates continued service and worship of Him. Men and women, make much of God throughout your week. Make much of God as you live your life with your spouse, and with your children. Make much of God as you're in your workplace. Make much of God when you're in your community, because God will be faithful to you, and you will rejoice in His presence. Let's close in prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you. We rejoice in what you have communicated to us in Psalm 132. Father, I pray that as we gather week after week to worship you, your faithfulness would be front and center in our hearts. I pray this morning, Father, that you would get victory in our lives as we recall again how faithful you have been even this past week to us. That as we enter into a new week that will bring its trials and its afflictions, just like David experienced, that by your grace we would seek to set some of those aside so that we can make decisions that would honor you, to pursue the things of God, and to know that in your faithfulness you will fulfill all your promises to us as well. And it's our prayer, Father, that you would get ultimate victory in our hearts and lives. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.